Hello and welcome to Hopewell's holiday video series funded by Bell Let's Talk. We hope you enjoy today's video.
So, welcome everyone. So, this evening we'll be talking about self trust. So, building, strengthening, and sustaining self trust for meaning, purpose, and satisfaction in life. And so, really, some of the objectives this evening is to define what is self trust, to look at that, as well as some of those key components and the importance and relevance of self trust that exists in our lives. And we'll also explore some strategies and skills for building self trust and how we can practice that as well to keep it sustained in our lives. So, those are some of the components this evening. And if any questions arise or you'd like to share an example, please don't hesitate to jump in I'll try and make sure the chat appears as well because Zoom is fantastic, but sometimes it can be challenging as well. So I will certainly do my best. So please don't be shy. And so the definition of self-trust. So self-trust is essentially the firm reliance on the integrity of yourself. But maintaining a good relationship with yourself, it's easier said than done because sometimes it can be easy to sustain a relationship with a partner, family member, or friend. But all relationships they do take time, effort, and good communication. And so if self-trust is challenging that integrity in yourself, it might be time to have that discussion with yourself. Are you in good communication with yourself? Because poor communication can lead to the perception that you abandoned yourself. And it can lead to a distorted perception of other relationships in your life as well. And so we're going to look at that. How do we start to build that integrity in our lives and that self-trust so that we can honor that process for ourselves? Because certainly at times we do have negative perceptions that emerge. So how can we cope with that when it does emerge? And interestingly, in Wall's book, she writes in The Courage to Trust, A Guide to Building Deep and Lasting Relationships, she says the person you need to trust first is yourself. No one can be as consistently supportive of you as you can learn to be. Being kind to yourself increases self-confidence and lessens your need for approval. Loving and caring for yourself not only increases self-trust, it can also deepen your connection with others. So interestingly, Wall highlights as well the importance of focusing in on oneself. And we talked about this the other week in self-compassion, because oftentimes we'll be quick to offer empathy and validation to another person, but it can be challenging for us to do that for ourselves. And so that's really what self-trust is doing, is building that within ourselves. That way we can have good communication with oneself and then others in our relationships. So how do we build self-trust, especially if self-trust is perhaps something that's challenging in your life right now, to really trust yourself, that integrity, and to rely on yourself? And regular communication and staying in touch with yourself is a good first step. And we talk to ourselves all day. Oftentimes it's cognitively, but thoughts emerge, and we do talk to ourselves quite a bit. And so it's important to ask, what are you saying to yourself? When do you talk to yourself the most? And what percentage of that self-talk that you engage in is positive or negative? And perhaps are
So I just got a message from Kate. She's just looking into her internet connection, but she said to hang in there. She will be back with us as soon as she can.
Awesome. Thanks for the update.
No problem. I'll keep you guys updated.
Just a quick question. It's Loriana here. It looks like I'm the host,
Yes.
and I have, it's asking me to accept people in the waiting room.
I would recommend waiting until Kate gets back.
Okay, so that's normal, right? It's not by accidentally happening. Okay.
Totally normal. Yeah, unless Kate requests to come in, just wait until she's back.
Okay, sounds good.
Oh, we see you, Kate. Can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Sorry about that, everyone. Something happened in my room, and so I just shifted into my mother's office. See, Zoom can be our best friend, or sometimes it can be really challenging. Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience, and I'll continue and share my screen. Okay. Okay, everyone, so we will try this again. So we were talking about how do we build self-trust. So regular communication and staying in touch with ourselves. And oftentimes we do talk to ourselves every day. Oftentimes it's internally through our thoughts and cognitions. And so it's important to ask ourselves, what are we saying to ourselves? What do you say the most? And what percentage is positive or negative? And when is it more positive or negative? And that's oftentimes when the critic comes out, the internal critic that we all have because we're human. And it can be a negative thinking process and distorted thoughts. And it's by no means anyone's fault because we are human. And so it can be helpful to be in touch with that. If it's all or nothing thinking, it could be labeling, it could be many things. One small example that I can share with you is fairly recent, again, a very small example. My younger brother is a basketball player. He's very good. And we were shooting hoops the other week. And I say we, let me finish. And so I tried to shoot a basket. It totally went flying, totally missed it. And then I just kind of looked at him and said, oh, I'm such a loser. And he stopped me. He goes, hey, Caitlin, you're not athletic. He's like, that's okay. You always did track and field, but you just missed the hoop. He said, that's okay. Let me show you. And he showed me. And so he's like, so what are you? And he challenged it gently. And I said, I'm just awkward, but I'm having fun. And so that was it. And it's interesting because the immediate negative thought that came into mind was self-critical when I was just a moment that I was enjoying and having fun. Again, that's a very small example because the inner critic can emerge when we're with other people, when we're at work, at any time. And it can be helpful to be in touch with that, to build that self-trust, to see how are we communicating with ourselves. And also to build self-trust, active listening, feeling, and increased awareness. So taking the time to listen to yourself, your body, to hear and feel what's going on emotionally, physically, and cognitively. So taking that time and try to refrain from jumping to conclusions because sometimes what you feel may or may not be accurate. And so you need to process it further. Again, something could emerge like a feeling of anxiety or stress and then quickly dissipate if we give ourselves time to process it. So to trust our body, our thoughts and emotions, to give ourselves that time and to try to learn when we are distorting thoughts. That way, if the thought comes up, then we can gently challenge that and say, okay, no, that's the critical part of me. So what's going on? Okay, I'm feeling a bit anxious. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to set my boundaries. So trusting that process to give yourself an opportunity to do so. And also positive reflection. So it lets you know that you are an interest in yourself and you're accurate in your understanding of yourself. So again, building self-trust, these methods, they take time, but it can be helpful to be more aware of strategies to do so, to help us in that process. And also to build self-trust, it can be helpful to clearly define problems and develop solutions. So design a plan or several options. Oftentimes, if we create a problem-solving strategy, we need to create a couple and to trust ourselves in that process, to give ourselves the space to do so. That way, if one doesn't work, we can go to another strategy. And that increases the integrity that we feel within ourselves and that self-respect. And to try to remain flexible in those plans because sometimes things come up and our plans need to shift, and that's okay. And we can evaluate the outcome and learn from what we could perceive as a mistake, but it can be an opportunity to learn that we might do things differently next time, whether it's in a conversation, a relationship with someone else, but we can learn from those strategies. And also self-respect. And it's interesting because there are different kinds of self-respect that do emerge. So respect for your values, what are they? Respect for your skills and being cognizant, what are they? Your hobbies and interests, identifying what they are. And also for the different kinds of relationships that you have in your life, family, work, friends, acquaintances. But how does one develop self-respect? because it can be hard depending on what's happening in our lives. It really begins with listening to yourself, the thoughts that emerge and feelings, being in touch with those without judgment. Because again, oftentimes our cognitions come up, our thoughts, and they're out of our control. So if it is a negative thought, not to be judgmental, but more compassionate towards yourself. And be willing to compromise as well. That sometimes things come up, certain challenges, and we do have to make compromises, and that's okay. And be willing to explore issues without feeling threatened and fearful. So to give yourself that space to look at any challenges or issues that come up. And if fear comes out, to remember that love is more powerful than fear. Self-love is more powerful than that fear. The fear that can also put us in our threat or drive system. But then the soothe system can come out when we have that compassion towards ourselves and the self-respect. And to deal with issues as they arise. It may be overwhelming at times, but to give yourself that time to process it. That way that you can address your needs. And that's where the self-trust comes up, to give yourself that space that you require. Other aspects as well include unconditional understanding and support. So no matter what, there is love and respect of self at your core. This is based on past self-trust, because self-trust, depending on situations, can feel broken. But in our lives, just as a vase can be broken, it can be repaired. And so if self-trust is challenging for you at this time, or perhaps someone you're close to, knowing that it can emerge, and it will, but it just takes time. So to give yourself that unconditional positive regard during those challenges. And also appreciation of self, of oneself. So list your successes. Small successes count too. And write an appreciation list, things which you are thankful for. Because gratitude is actually linked to more positive emotions. And in the brain, we're wired that when we have more gratitude, and it can be just 2 or 3 things that you jot down, and it can be the same thing every day, and that's okay. Because when we do that, we feel more positive, and we begin to develop that integrity within ourselves and that self-trust. And self-honesty. Could you be in denial about certain issues, or perhaps avoiding them altogether? Does your lack of self-honesty sabotage yourself? Does it sabotage you? And so if it does, consider a reality check by talking to yourself in a kind, compassionate way, a psychotherapist, or a very trusted friend. Because if you are self-sabotaging, again, oftentimes it doesn't even happen intentionally. It can be helpful to reach out to others for support in that process. Because when we do that and we disclose things with someone we trust and feel comfortable with, we hear what we're saying. And that leads to self-reflection and increased self-awareness. And that can help us develop that integrity within ourselves and that self-respect and kindness. So it's a process. And we touched on this earlier. The opposite of self-trust is self-criticism. And oftentimes self-criticism, it can easily roll off the tongue. And it's not that we do it intentionally, but it just happens. Those negative thinking styles that come up. And if that happens, it can be that internal talk that's being negative, disparaging, or berating towards ourselves. It could be labeling, calling ourselves certain things. Like if we say the statement, I am, oftentimes with negative self-talk, it could be labeling. Like, oh, I'm so stupid. I'm so embarrassed and such an idiot, etc. It can range differently for people. It can be the all or nothing thinking as well, catastrophizing. Oh, I failed this test. I didn't do that well. I'm going to fail this whole course. I'm going to drop out of school, etc. There can be a myriad of examples. It could be in terms of, I missed my meal plan. Oh, I'm going to relapse and the eating disorder is not going to go away. And you can see that comes all or nothing thinking. And so with that, the content of self-critical thoughts, they can be very cruel, and the tone can be very harsh and reprimanding. And oftentimes this thinking style, it occurs within us to varying degrees, and it is common in our society. So if we do struggle with self-criticism, what do we do with that? Especially when we're trying to build self-trust, because the self-critic can make us question our integrity and ourselves. So one helpful style, if you're aware of cognitive behavioral therapy and CBT, they often look at this and thought records, and you can write it down or you can do it within your mind. Think of, okay, what's the evidence for this? Is there any evidence for this belief or thought that emerged? So for example, oh, I missed a meal, or I screwed up my meal plan. I'm going to relapse. I've relapsed. I'm going to do terrible with my recovery. Is there any evidence for that? You missed a meal. Okay, it happens. So what will you do to make up for that? So you start to challenge some of those thoughts and beliefs. Because oftentimes, is there any evidence against that? Well, that's never happened. I was busy. It was an honest mistake. So you start to look at the self-criticism and challenge it and realize there's no evidence. And if there is evidence, oftentimes it's very lenient, it's very minor, and that can be beneficial, because then we realize that self-criticism isn't accurate. And again, it's no fault of anyone's, because oftentimes in our society, we can be judgmental towards ourselves, and that can get in the way of our self-trust. So this is one other strategy to start challenging that. And it allows us to really start developing that self-trust, because if the thought emerges in the future, we'll realize, okay, I've had this before, I thought this before, okay, what's going on? I'm feeling anxious, etc. It depends on the person. And other practices to strengthen our connection to ourselves can be meditation. So time spent mediating and meditating about strengths and your connection to yourself. So focusing inwards allows you to know more about who you are and what you want. Oh, sorry, just 1 second. I'm busy. So meditation, that can be really helpful, because it allows you to reflect inwardly and to really be in grasp with the present moment. Because oftentimes we might dwell on the past, jump to the future, but meditation can really help us connect more to ourselves. And gratitude. When practicing gratitude, put a me spin on it and try to be grateful for part of your personality. So I'm thankful that I see that I'm smiling, I'm kind, I'm thankful that I'm doing well at work, etc., whatever that may be. I'm thankful that my recovery is going well and the eating disorder is becoming part of my past, whatever that may be. But the gratitude can increase that positivity. And also connection. Spend time with people who are reinforcing, that promote you and your development, your goals, who promote you. And choose those who applaud effort and model resilience. Because again, we're not perfect, but finding someone who emulates that resilience and strength, that can be really encouraging, especially as you're trying to strengthen your connection to yourself, to build that integrity and self-trust. And so it can be helpful to develop relationships like that, so they're more prevalent in your life. And to remember that only you are truly in charge and in control of how you feel. And oftentimes feelings do emerge, and they could be triggered by different situations, but that's okay. Give yourself the space to process them, to experience them. And the thoughts that come up, give yourself the opportunity to reflect on them, to take that time, because that is your self-trust emerging. And again, there will be times where it feels challenging, but that's okay. It's part of the process of strength, resilience, and self-kindness and healing. And self-trust, it can be delicate and fragile at times. It can. And Walter Anderson writes, interestingly, trust is like a vase. Once it's broken, though you can fix it, the vase will be different. Because self-trust is a delicate quality and process, because it's subject to dramatic shifts within our psyche, based on what we do and how we act. And that's okay. For the majority of people, self-trust is a fragile as glass vase needing a concrete floor at times. The reason for this is because we haven't put in the work into developing our self-trust. Things get in the way, and that can be a strong force. But to remember that self-trust, it can emerge, and it just takes time. And for those who have immense amount of self-trust, their quality of self-trust can be as strong as can be because they put the work into it and the time in that process. And for all of us, the goal is to create a strong foundation of self-trust so that we can always have that power within our grasp. So to give yourself the time to do that, because it is within our grasp, that integrity. But it can be challenged at times or feel thwarted. And that's part of the process. And that's okay. And when the negative critic emerges, to know that you're human and to go back to something more positive to reframe it. And it could be as simple as saying, okay, I've got this. I am enough. I am resilient. Whatever that may be, that mantra, hold on to that, because self-trust will be challenged at times, and that's okay. Because other times it will feel like a strong foundation. So to be more aware of what you're thinking and feeling, to give yourself that time in your process. And perhaps you already have self-trust that's very strong. And then maybe it becomes more fragile on another occasion. And just to remember, that's okay. It changes and it shifts, but we are human, growing, learning. Our thoughts, feelings, even how we feel physically, it changes. And that's okay to give yourself that space, because once we do, it creates more meaning and purpose in our lives. It can motivate us and strengthen us. And meaning and purpose can shift and change, and that's okay. To trust yourself, the integrity that you have in that process, that it may shift and change. And that's part of the process. And so, as we highlighted today, is that self-trust is the firm reliance on the integrity of yourself. And the firm reliance being very strong, but just to keep in mind, as we talked about earlier and I highlighted, that it can shift. And that's okay. To give yourself that self-compassion and that kindness during those occasions. And building self-trust takes time and various practices. It can be writing, but gratitude, it can be meditation, that increased self-awareness. It could be talking to a trusted friend, a therapist, or someone that you're really close with. And it can also be challenging some of that negative thinking that comes up, some of those distorted thoughts, because cognitively, as I mentioned earlier, thoughts just emerge, but to give yourself the time to process that. So remember, self-trust, it does take time and practice, but once we begin to do it more, the integrity emerges and it becomes less unfamiliar. It becomes a part of who we are. And to be compassionate towards yourself in that process, because it can be challenging, things emerge, and that's okay. And meaning and purpose in our lives can shift and change if something changes at work or our goals, intentions, relationships. And that's okay, because when we find meaning and purpose, our integrity is fueled and self-trust, especially when it's something that we're passionate about or inspires ourselves. And someone may be like, oh, why are you doing that? But to remember, bring it back to yourself internally, because there are critics out there, but to remember that self-trust is that firm reliance on yourself. And it's a process that takes time. The vase, it could be feel a bit chipped at times, but to know that love, self-love is truly more powerful than fear, and to give yourself that space to do so.